So today we're looking at energy releasing pathways. How do organisms get the energy that they need to fuel life processes? As I said before, we kind of say, generally speaking, that we get energy from the sun. Like some organisms utilize energy from the sun for processes such as photosynthesis. And then we say, oh, we get energy from the foods that we eat. So we're going to take a deeper look today and see exactly how we go from consuming food, okay, so physical consumption of food, to the actual release of energy into our bodies. And so we're looking at the pathways for which that happens, okay? These are some biochemical pathways that take place in our bodies, and we basically, consider these forms of metabolism. All right, we talked about metabolism very early in the semester, that is a requirement for life, and metabolism is just that general term again for, the chemical reactions that are going on in our bodies, digestion and so forth. So we're going to look today again at the pathways at which we go from consuming food, as eukaryotic organisms, to actually basically breaking that food down, the glucose in those foods, to release that biochemical energy that's stored in it so that we can get the energy we need for survival. So the introduction to today's lesson is that living cells require energy from outside sources in order to perform the many tasks. And so the question is, how do cells obtain their energy? All right. For eukaryotic organisms, that's going to be a very simple answer. We're getting the energy that we need from the foods that we eat. Okay. So we're going to look at a process today known as, does anyone know what this process is called for how we actually break down the foods that we eat in order to get energy? Does anyone remember from high school?
Is it cellular respiration?
Cellular respiration, absolutely. Thank you, Michael. So we're going to look at what happens during cellular respiration today. It's a pretty involved process, but I just want us to kind of make sure we get the basics and understand some general concepts with cellular respiration, and not to confuse that with, when we say respiration, oftentimes we think about breathing. Well, we're talking about an actual biochemical pathway right now. It does require oxygen in order for it to occur. So we sometimes refer to it as aerobic respiration, but yes, cellular respiration. And then also, autotrophs are organisms that also utilize some of the acquired energy from the sun during the process of photosynthesis. So these are two pathways that we're going to look at today for how organisms acquire and utilize energy. All right. Here we're talking about most other organisms, apart from autotrophic organisms, make ATP by breaking down glucose. Okay, so we're consuming foods. We talked about this a few chapters back, that the carbohydrates, the proteins, the lipids, all these different forms of foods that we eat, those can all be potential sources for glucose. So our bodies want to break down glucose as the preferred energy source. Okay, so we're eating these carbs and proteins and so forth. And so we'll just generally say organic substances are being broken down via this process of cellular respiration. And we're going to look at that today. And there are a couple things that I want us to note about cellular respiration. Like, what is it? Why is it important? Okay, where does it take place? Okay, what does this process look like? And what products are made? All right, so we're going to take a journey into that today. I'll start this again by talking about this term metabolism. Write it down if you still aren't clear what this term means. Metabolism simply refers to the series of chemical reactions that take place in our bodies, okay? Any of the reactions that are fueling the cellular processes that our bodies undergo all day long, okay? So everything from respiration, digestion, production of urine, our bodies are undergoing chemical reactions all day long. And so collectively, we refer to that, those activities as metabolism. All right. I see a question in the chat. Oh, okay. So metabolism, we're talking about the chemical reactions that take place in our bodies. So there's two types of reactions that can go on. It can either be reactions that are, building up or synthesizing or making new products or new substances or new molecules. And we'll call that anabolism, where we're building and synthesizing new products. But then there are also reactions that lead to the breakdown okay, of products. We'll call that catabolism, where we're breaking down large, complex molecules into smaller, more usable forms. And we call that catabolism. Okay, so do make a note of the differences between anabolism and catabolism. Okay, these processes are very different. And we're looking today at a catabolic pathway, catabolism, where we're breaking down glucose, okay, as the major form for providing energy. All right. So cellular respiration is an example of a catabolic pathway where we're breaking down glucose. All right. So these catabolic pathways, we're interested in them because we yield energy, all right, by breaking down these organic substances that we consume in the form of food. So again, those carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, any number of things can start or serve as a starting point for our attempt to obtain or acquire energy, okay? But those substances do have to be broken down in order to access that biochemical energy that it contains. So there are two types of catabolic pathways that lead to the production of ATP, and that's where we're going today. Make a note of these two pathways: cellular respiration, okay, also known as aerobic respiration, and I mentioned that term earlier, and that's due to the rate limiting factor of oxygen having to be present for those final stages of cellular respiration. All right, and then there's anaerobic respiration, or the type of respiration that takes place in the absence of oxygen, and we call that fermentation. Okay, so we're looking at two pathways today that result in the production of ATP, okay, the storage form of energy that our cells utilize to fuel processes. What questions do we have? Awesome. So aerobic respiration, also known as cellular respiration, is a process that's utilized mostly by eukaryotic cells. Okay, cellular respiration is a process that breaks down glucose in a series of steps, and we're going to look briefly at those steps today to convert that biochemical energy in our foods into usable ATP. Okay, so we mentioned earlier in the semester that we can represent what's going on in a chemical reaction by a chemical equation. So here is the equation for cellular respiration that you do need to know. You should be able to readily identify this equation, okay? Cellular respiration, what's happening? So we know for sure that we're inhaling oxygen. Oxygen is in fact a requirement for life for us, right? So we breathe in oxygen and we eat food, right? So those glucose molecules, so we'll say sugar here, particularly glucose, is our preferred energy source. So we can breathe in oxygen, we consume that food, and we lead, and those molecules are converted, and the products that are made are carbon dioxide, water, and then that release of energy into our bodies. All right. You do need to know this equation for cellular respiration. And again, try and think about it intuitively about what happens with your body. What's going on? We're breathing in oxygen. We have to consume food. Those are two necessary components for life for us. Okay. And you know that we exhale carbon dioxide when we breathe. Okay. So carbon dioxide is a byproduct, water, and also energy in the form of ATP. What questions do we have about that? Awesome. So this is just a visual, you know, I know some of us are visual, I'm quite visual. So in our bodies, so this is just a representation of someone going about their day exercising. You're breathing in air, you're consuming foods, your body is doing a lot of work. This process is cellular respiration to break down this work to continue to fuel that workout. And you're releasing or producing carbon dioxide in the process. You know, water is a byproduct, and then energy is being released. Okay, and so that is true. When they say, you know, if you haven't eaten all day, you might feel tired, lethargic, you don't have energy. That's because your body doesn't have what it needs. If you haven't eaten all day, there's nothing to break down to release that energy into your body. So yes, you will feel lethargic and lazy if you don't eat properly. So aerobic respiration. This process takes place over 3 stages. Write that down. We're going to look briefly at these 3 stages. And when you go on into your study modules and you're reading your smart book chapters, you're going to see a lot more detail about aerobic respiration. But I just want us to kind of, again, scratch the surface a little bit right now and just understand sort of the big picture. So this process, right, of breaking down this glucose occurs in 3 different stages. Okay. The first stage is glycolysis. You've probably heard about it before. The next phase is the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle. Some literature might say the TCA cycle. I don't know why this thing has so many names. And then the electron transport chain. Okay. These are all 3 stages that are involved in the breakdown of glucose in order to release energy. And so there's 2 things I want us to know here. Not only do I want you to know the names of those 3 stages, I want you to talk about or be familiar with the intracellular location of where these stages take place. Okay. The first stage of aerobic respiration is glycolysis. Okay. That process is going to take place out in the cytoplasm of the cell, right? And we'll get a little bit of energy production there. But the remaining stages, the final stages where we get the most abundant energy production is going to take place where in the cell? Inside of what? Where do we get the most energy production in the cell?
Mitochondria.
Inside of a mitochondrion. All right. So we explored this back when we took a tour of the cell. We explored and understand that the mitochondria is where ATP is formed. All right. So that's something that we're pulling together here. This process is going to start out in the cytoplasm and produce a little bit of energy in that first stage. But then there are 2 successive stages that are going to take place and be completed in the mitochondria. And that's where we're going to get our most abundant energy production. Go ahead and make a note of that. Okay. So we need to know what are the names of the 3 stages and where are these taking place as far as being inside of the cell. All right. So a quick summary here for those of us that are visual. We're saying that our bodies undergo a catabolic pathway that we call cellular respiration in order to acquire energy. All right. That process takes place across 3 different stages. The first stage is glycolysis. Okay. Glycolysis starts to break down that glucose, and an intermediate molecule called pyruvate acid will be created. Pyruvate is made, right? And when that pyruvate is made, there's also a production of energy. So from the first stage of cellular respiration, glycolysis, there are 2 ATP molecules being made. Write that down. I want you to know how much ATP is being made at each stage of aerobic respiration. Okay, so step 1, glycolysis. We're getting 2 molecules of ATP being made, right? That's the initial degradation or breakdown of glucose taking place. And that glucose is converted into pyruvate. Then, and so that's happening out in the cytoplasm, remember? Then the rest of the process commences in the mitochondria when there is oxygen available, all right? The Krebs cycle commences, and then there are 2 more molecules of ATP being made. And then the most productive process here for the production of ATP is going to be the electron transport system, okay? This electron transport system is going to create 32 molecules of ATP for a grand total of 36 ATP molecules from breaking down 1 glucose. Now, as I said before, I'm not going to kid you that there are a lot of intricate things happening in this process, and you'll see those as you read, but I don't want us to get hung up on those details just yet. So let's walk through this a little bit more slowly. Cellular respiration is the body's attempt to break down the foods that we eat, those glucose molecules, in order to get energy. First stage of that is called glycolysis, okay? Glycolysis occurs out in the cytoplasm of the cell. It requires an input of energy for it to get started, okay? But at this point, there is no requirement for oxygen. So if you were asked, you should understand that glycolysis, which is the first stage of cellular respiration, it can commence without there being oxygen, okay? And the net yield of ATP molecules at this stage is going to be 2. And you'll notice as you're reading through your smart book chapters that we use the term net yield. That's because to get started, there's also an input of energy. Okay, so we have to take into account from the energy that's being generated, how much is also being utilized when we end up with our total net yield of 36 ATPs. So let's look at this schematic right here. Do not get overwhelmed. It's not as busy as you think it is. So there's 2 things happening here. This gray part represents the inside of the cell, okay? This orange part out here, this peach area, represents the external environment, okay? And we're clear that this structure right here called what separates the inside of the cell from the external environment. What do we call this structure?
Cell membrane.
Right. So right here we have the cell membrane. Okay, so we have the inside of the cell, the intracellular compartments, and then we have the external environment. So we've eaten some food, and now we have our glucose. All right, glucose has to enter the cell. All right, we've already talked about some mechanisms for how we transport substances into and out of the cell. Right, talked about the endocytosis, exocytosis. We talked about, you know, transport, facilitated transport. Osmosis, diffusion. We talked about a number of different ways for which we can get substances into the cell. So glucose makes its way into the cell, and now cellular respiration begins. Inside of the cell, glycolysis is the first stage of cellular respiration, which is going to start to break down this glucose. Okay, this glucose has to be metabolized. The first step of cellular respiration is going to lead to a little energy production. How many ATP molecules are we getting from glycolysis?
2.
2. Okay. So the process continues, and that glucose molecule is converted into this intermediate substance that we call pyruvate, right? Or pyruvic acid. And then, dependent on the presence of oxygen, in this case, we're in cellular respiration, so oxygen is present. Okay. After we've had our pyruvate created, the process continues inside of the mitochondria. All right. There, the Krebs cycle or the TCA cycle, as well as the electron transport chain continues, and we have our optimal production of ATP from the electron transport chain. All right. So you should be able to summarize and understand what happens during cellular respiration. Glucose is being broken down. The first step is glycolysis. Pyruvate is going to be the intermediate that's made as we're breaking down that glucose. Those pyruvate are going to be further converted inside of the mitochondria to lead to our final optimal production of ATP right here in this mitochondrion. This is what happens when oxygen is present, okay? We'll come back to this when we start talking about what happens when there is no oxygen. Okay, so we're clear about that first stage. Let's keep going. The final stages of aerobic respiration. So after glycolysis takes place out there in the cytoplasm, we see that the remaining 2 steps or stages take place inside of the mitochondria. Okay, so the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain are completed in the mitochondria. Okay, and from this breakdown of that one molecule of glucose, we're going to get a total net yield of 36 ATP molecules per glucose during aerobic respiration. Okay, cellular respiration. Write that down. Those final two stages are taking place inside of a mitochondrion, and it's going to lead to a final yield of a total of 36 ATPs from a single glucose molecule. Now, of course, this is under optimal cellular conditions. All right. And so this is just our summary slide again to recap what I just said. Aerobic respiration occurs across 3 stages. We start with glycolysis. That glucose is broken down to pyruvic acid. We get our 2 molecules of ATP from glycolysis. In the presence of oxygen, the process will continue over in the mitochondrion. The Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain happens, and we have a total of 36 ATPs. So what's the designation from each stage in those final 2 stages? Citric acid cycle, the Krebs cycle is going to yield us an additional 2. So we've gotten 2 from glycolysis. We're getting 2 molecules of ATP from the Krebs cycle, and we're getting 32 molecules from the electron transport chain. So we're clear that the electron transport chain is the most productive stage of cellular respiration, where we get the most ATP being produced. All right. So if I were to show you a chart or ask you, could you fill these missing pieces in right here? Like if I blanked out the names of these stages, okay, if I blanked out or asked you to tell me how much energy is produced at each stage, you should be able to tell me that. If I ask you to label or identify the cellular location where, you know, different stages are taking place, is either going to be the cytoplasm or the mitochondrion, you should be able to do that. Any questions? Questions? Awesome. So from aerobic respiration, we're going to get a total yield of 36 ATPs. That is what you need to know. Here are some checkpoint questions that I want you to complete for homework in your notebook. You will not submit this set of questions right here today. Now, that's cellular respiration. That's what happens when there is oxygen present. But we know that there are some organisms that do not require oxygen to survive. So how do they get energy? Let's take a look at what happens during anaerobic respiration. Write that down. Anaerobic respiration is going to be respiration that occurs in the absence of oxygen. Okay, so we're going to contrast that with aerobic. Okay, in biology, that prefix "an" means without. So this is a process that's utilized by prokaryotes. Okay, so now we're talking about these simple single-celled organisms that do not require oxygen. Okay, and what we'll subsequently see is that they also don't have the same energy requirements. Okay, so they only require a small production of energy to fuel the processes that they must undergo day to day. And so anaerobic respiration is utilized by prokaryotes, okay? And it takes place in the absence of oxygen, and this is how cells generate the ATP, basically through that first step that we saw earlier, glycolysis, because we said that glycolysis was not oxygen dependent. And then the process continues into fermentation. All right, so in this case, prokaryotic organisms utilize fermentation as a way of breaking down the carbohydrates in the absence of oxygen. Okay, so we have cellular respiration, which is the process that's used by eukaryotes that are breaking down those carbohydrate molecules in the presence of oxygen. Okay, that's cellular respiration. And then we have fermentation, which is utilized by prokaryotes to break down those carbohydrates in the absence of oxygen. Okay, let's make sure we're clear on these two catabolic pathways. So anaerobic respiration takes place in the absence of oxygen. It is taking place out in the cytoplasm of the cell. Now, why do we know that to be true? Because again, we said that this is happening in prokaryotic organisms. We saw back in our tour of the cell that prokaryotic organisms don't have what? What do they not have? in comparison.
Organelles.
They don't have those organelles. Absolutely. So we're clear that anaerobic respiration takes place out in the cytoplasm of the cell. There is no mitochondria. There are no other membrane-bound organelles in these organisms, okay? And so not much ATP is going to be generated during anaerobic respiration. In fact, there's only going to be a net production of 2 ATP molecules per glucose. And those are the 2 that we saw that were made during glycolysis. Okay, so in totality, we're saying that anaerobic respiration is a less efficient method of producing energy, okay? And so it's typically utilized by small, simple-celled organisms, single-celled organisms such as prokaryotes. And there are some yeast, okay, and we'll see that in a minute, that also utilize fermentation to break down carbohydrates. But don't confuse the fact that yeast are eukaryotic, although they're single-celled, okay? So let's look back at this pathway here. Anaerobic respiration, okay, is the shift in the pathway here for the breakdown of carbohydrates in the absence of oxygen. So we come in, this glucose is entering the cell as it normally would. The first step is also going to still remain glycolysis, okay? We're gonna get our 2 ATP molecules being made. Glucose is broken down into pyruvate. However, the pathway shifts into fermentation due to the absence of oxygen. Okay, and during fermentation, this glucose is not going to be, there's not going to be any more energy production at this point. Our final products are going to be different. It's going to be either alcohol or lactic acid. Okay, so fermentation is the breakdown of carbohydrates in an anaerobic atmosphere where the production leads to either lactic acid, lactate, or alcohol, ethanol. All right, so you should be able to distinguish between what's happening with cellular respiration, which occurs in the presence of oxygen, and then what happens in the absence of oxygen. In absence of oxygen, that pathway shifts to fermentation. Okay, so let's continue looking at fermentation. Okay, so fermentation, this is anaerobic respiration. Glycolysis is the first stage of fermentation. It's going to yield those 2 molecules of ATP. And so we're saying that this provides enough energy for some of those single-celled organisms that utilize this process. Okay, and the final stages are going to be fermentation, where there are no ATP being produced. Make sure you write that down. During the final stages of anaerobic respiration or fermentation, there's no energy produced. The only energy that's produced during fermentation is during glycolysis, that first step.
There's
And
no energy produced because there's no oxygen. Like there's nothing to like.
right, because oxygen, the rate limiting step here is going to be the presence or absence of oxygen. If we look at this schematic right here, glycolysis can commence, but after that pyruvic acid is created, the pathway shifts to cellular respiration in the presence of oxygen, but in the absence of oxygen, it's going to shift to fermentation.
Okay.
So there's no ATP produced in those final stages, okay? So this is just another summary slide here. Our goal is that we're trying to break down those carbohydrates, that glucose, right? And the pathway starts out the same, whether there's oxygen present or not. Glucose begins to be broken down into pyruvic acid. And during that first step of glycolysis, 2 ATPs will be made. But depending on whether or not oxygen is available, or if there's no oxygen available, we will have the pathway shift into anaerobic respiration or aerobic respiration. Okay, so if there is oxygen available, aerobic respiration takes place, and it completes in the mitochondrion, and we have a total production of 36 ATPs. However, if oxygen is not available, the pathway shifts into fermentation, and our products are going to be either lactic acid or ethanol. That's what I want you all to know right now. So there's two pathways for fermentation or anaerobic respiration after glycolysis. Either alcohol fermentation, which is going to lead to the production of ethanol, or lactic acid fermentation, which produces lactate. Okay. Alcohol fermentation is a process that typically happens in small single cell organisms such as bacteria or yeast. All right. And you probably have heard about this. Well, you haven't taken micro yet, but in the production of like a lot of the foods that we drink and foods that we eat and drinks that we drink. So like wine, cheese, beer, bread, those types of substance foods are created through fermentation. Okay. And then lactic acid fermentation takes place in animals like eukaryotic organisms. We can undergo lactic acid fermentation in the absence of oxygen. It's actually what happens when you're exercising. If you've ever been exercising and you start to feel like a burn in your muscles, that's because your muscles are being depleted of oxygen, and you start to produce that lactic acid, and it's gonna burn. Okay, that's what's happening. So fermentation, I just wanted to make sure I insert this slide. You'll get a lot more about this in micro next semester. Hopefully I'm teaching it. I love teaching microbiology. Well, we'll see how we actually exploit properties of microorganisms such as this fermentation. So different organisms utilize fermentation. So lactobacillus, that's a bacteria. Aspergillus, that's yeast or fungi. Saccharomyces are yeast. These all utilize fermentation, and we exploit these properties to make a lot of the things that we consume in our daily diet. Okay. So this last slide is just a pathway comparison slide where I want you to, be able to compare these two pathways, aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration is also known as cellular respiration. It is a pathway that requires oxygen, and it is utilized by complex eukaryotic organisms for energy production, and it's going to yield a very nice amount of energy, 36 ATPs per glucose molecule. So that's pretty good under optimal conditions. In contrast, anaerobic respiration is also known as fermentation. This process does not require oxygen, and it's used mostly by single-celled organisms like prokaryotes, but also some yeast. And this is not the most efficient manner for generating ATP, as we're only going to get 2 ATPs being generated per glucose molecule. So this is just another, I like these what do you call these graphics, because they kind of help you walk through what's happening in this pathway. So we have these organic compounds that we consume, right? Those carbohydrates, lipids, and so forth as our sources of glucose, right? And we're breaking them down. Okay, that first step is going to be glycolysis. All right, glucose is broken down to pyruvic acid. All right, ATP is going to be produced during glycolysis. And then we have this rate limiting step right here. Is oxygen available or not? If there is no oxygen available, the pathway shifts into fermentation, and the final products are going to be either lactic acid or ethanol. Okay. If oxygen is available, the pathway shifts into respiration. It will continue in a mitochondrion and produce up to 36 molecules of ATP per glucose, and carbon dioxide and water are byproducts that are also generated during this process. So I'm going to stop here today because that's actually a lot of information. Let's stop recording.